Hey there, it's Olivia-Savannah here from Olivia's Catastrophe, and today I'm here to give you a bit of discussion on indie published romance versus traditionally published romance. And I'm not going to be pitting them against each other to say which is better, but I want to have a discussion on the ways in which those two types of romance books tend to differ and be similar. To begin with, I want to tell you about the book that has inspired all of this, and that is Boyfriend Material by Alexis Hall. So I'm a big, long-time fan of Alexis Hall. I've read pretty much his entire, not all of his entire, but a lot of his indie backlist. And Boyfriend Material was his first traditionally published romance book of his that I read. And I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, but there were so many ways in which I was also disappointed in it because it was just so unlike anything of his I have read otherwise when it was traditionally published. And there are a few more of his books out now. Husband Material is about to come out, and A Lady for a Duke is out, and Rosie Palmer Takes the Cake is also out. So there's lots of his traditionally published romance that I still need to read to see about these comparisons, but it got me thinking about the ways in which traditional and indie publishing differs, and I just wanted to have a bit of a discussion with all of you about that. To begin with though, you need to know about my romance reading experience. I am a fan of reading romance books. I have been ever since I accidentally picked up my first new adult, very steamy indie published book at 12, unintentionally. I did not mean to. I thought it was about vampires. And it was, but it was more about sex. I've been a long-time fan of romance books, but I started, and up until like the past 2 to 3 years, I pretty much exclusively read indie published romance, and I was happy with that. I found some of my favorite authors that way, as I mentioned, Alexis Hall, and I did also find Santino Hassel, but nobody talks about him anymore because he was toxic and awful and did some really terrible lying and gaslighting and things like that, but I literally read everything Santino Hassel wrote and loved it. So those were kind of the 2 big indie authors that I read, but other than that, some other indie authors that I really love are Rowan Powish, her Riven Rend series. That series is one of my favorites, but I've read some of her other stuff as well. I really enjoyed Megan Erickson for a while there. She did have a series that was published with Santino Hassel, and I raced my way through those. And then also Adriana Herrera, when she was indie published. I think she's now traditionally published, but the books of hers that I've read have all been indie published so far. And more recently, I've been bridging into trying some of the more traditionally published romance books that have come on my radar because of social media. So I've read Boyfriend Material, of course, which is then Alexis Hall's traditionally published one, even though his indie published works are my absolute favorites. I've read so many of those. Other traditionally published authors, I've started an Emily Henry, so I just need to continue and try that. I want to try Christina Lauren. I've read Talia Hibbert. I've read Jackie Lau, who was indie published, but again, I've only read traditionally published stuff. Similar story for Talia Hibbert. She was indie published, but I've only ever read her traditional stuff. Ali Hazelwood, I read The Love Hypothesis when it was traditionally published, although it was originally fanfic. So even the traditionally published romance authors I've read are pretty much all ones that were indie published at some point, but I haven't read their indie published works, most likely. I've broken this down into a few points that I want to talk about, and first of all, I would like to talk about length of text. So while I've mentioned some of my favourite authors, do be aware that I've read a lot of one-off novels from indie published authors, so I've got that experience behind me. And what I tend to find with indie published romance books is that they are so much shorter than the traditionally published books that I'm reading now. I think it was a bit of a shock to me when I started reading some of the traditionally published romance books because they all seem to fall into the 350 to 400 page camp, and I was like, what? Why is it taking so long? Why is there so much to these books? And that's because there's just a lot more time and a lot more expansion on things that you don't always get in indie published books. Indie published books tend to be a bit more, in terms of romance, a bit more shorter, a bit more to the point, a bit more get on with it, more than the traditionally published ones are. Just going to mention here that I'm going to say trad and indie to kind of summarize and keep things short and sweet. But in indie, I do tend to see time jumps. I do tend to see faster pace in terms of shorter chapters and getting to the point in things. And with those time jumps, it doesn't even mean that more length of time is happening in the trad books. Instead, what we're seeing is you just jump over scenes that are irrelevant and not so useful and just get to the good bit, which is the romance. And when I say get to the good bit, I don't even mean get to the sex scenes. Sometimes I mean that, but sometimes I mean get to the emotional scenes, get to the heart-to-hearts, and just cut out all of that extra stuff in between. Whereas with some trad books, you just get more. There's more of everything, and I don't always mean more sex scenes. I just mean there's more of the characters interacting emotionally, but also more of the characters interacting with secondary characters. And I have to say that's one of the biggest differences that I see, because I'm not saying indie books don't have any secondary characters whatsoever. They very much clearly and obviously do. I've heard countless and seen and read countless examples of that, but the secondary characters don't always necessarily have their own storyline, don't always necessarily have their own romance, and are mostly there to just kind of tune in to the main character's life when it's relevant for them to say something or give advice. They're not really fully fleshed, fully developed characters in books. Whereas in other traditionally romance books, you will see those secondary characters have much more presence. For example, the sister relationship that I'm seeing in book lovers so far is part of the story and is a big and important part of the story. And in Jackie Lau's Do Not Fall in Love, there's quite a few scenes with friends where they're talking about their hobbies and experiences and things like that that don't really have anything directly to do with the romance, but we're getting to see set up for either planned books in the series or just set up for a nice friendship relationship. And while I am saying that indie does have friendships in it, it doesn't do that as much as trad books seem to do. So there's definitely something that trad romance books do where there's still a bit more of a fully rounded story where you're getting the romance, that's the main thing, and that's the main drama and tension, but you also get to see secondary characters and friends and jokes and happy moments that are exclusive and separate from the romance. Whereas indie books that are romance tend to more so focus on the romance and therefore tend to be shorter and sweeter. And I have to admit, one of my favourite things to do as a romance reader is to start reading at 10 p.m. and to finish reading sometime in the early morning from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. And I'm finding it's not that possible for me to do as someone with a full-time job reading trad romance, because they're just so much longer and they're not really made to be consumed in one whole night, whereas the indie ones are definitely so, and I can stay up and I can have a glass of wine and get all the way through them. Another thing that I found very, very different is writing style, and I think that is where I'm really going to highlight Boyfriend Material as something that has prompted this, because one thing that I've always loved about Alexis Hall is the way that his writing style is so literary. Those books that you see winning the Women's Prize and Booker Prize, that level of writing and that style of writing, not level of writing, because that's a bit, you know, writing classist, writism? I don't think that's a word, but that's a bit segregating that writing level when you can write to that level in romance too. But that writing style where it's kind of penned in a very lyrical, beautiful way with all of these metaphors in it, Alexis Hall did that, but he would be describing like someone's nipple or something a bit more down south, and it would be like not even just one line, but he would give a whole paragraph to describing the angle that something is raised at, and it was beautifully written and could have won awards with that language, and I appreciated seeing that very lyrical, gorgeous writing style. But trad romance does not really carry that writing style, and that's why reading Boyfriend Material was like a shock of cold water on my face, because it felt like someone had poured a bucket of water on Alexis Hall's natural writing style and toned it way down. Of course, I need to read more of his trad books to really, you know, back up this whole point of writing style changes, but I do think there is a distinct difference between the writing style, not the content even, not the characters even, but the writing style of indie romance and trad romance. And it's interesting to see that difference and interesting to see that distinction, because I do think the one thing that I'm struggling with trad romance is that in terms of writing style, it all kind of blends together and reads the same. This is going to bring me into several of my other points actually, and that is language, which I think is really important when it comes to romance. How do I describe this? So in terms of the steamy scenes, which romance is kind of known for having more than other genres, in terms of the steamy scenes, language is really important for personal preference and the language people use to describe certain body parts. So I can gel with an author because of the words that they use to describe body parts more than others. For example, I really loved Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. I gave it 5 stars, but I don't particularly like the word tits. I don't really think it's not saying it's a bad word, but I don't like that description word for boobs. Like, I'd rather say boobs than tits. And in terms of all body parts, there are several words, different choices of language you could use to describe a body part, and it's very interesting to me the words in which traditional publishing tend to use versus the words in which indie published books tend to use, and they are very different, and they're different for different reasons, but I do think they seem to be a bit more neutral and toned in traditional publishing over indie publishing. But that doesn't mean the scenes themselves are any less steamy, it's just the language choices that are distinctly different, consistently different, and are worth noting in this discussion. It also brings me on to the point in terms of writing style and language chosen. We've got to talk about creativity and creative license. And I've wanted to bring in some more voices into this discussion. So I asked Nicole, from Who Picked That Book, who reads a lot more romance than I do, to kind of weigh in terms of the creative license of authors, traditionally and indie published.
Hi everyone, my name is Nicole. My channel name is Who Picked This Book. Thank you so much, Olivia, for inviting me to come on here and discuss traditional publishing versus indie publishing, especially in regards to romance. I have two different points of view when it comes to traditionally published work versus indie published work. One as a reader and then the other as an aspiring author. I'll start with the reader aspect first. I have been reading a lot more indie published work, especially within the last year. I have a few author interviews on my channel, those of which who have started off indie and have continued with indie publishing, but I also have an author that I speak to that she was in traditional publishing and then moved to indie publishing, and she started her own publishing house. So it was really interesting making that dive into indie published romances. And what I've learned from that is that traditional publishing tends to be more restrictive, especially with romance, just because of the explicitness of the content that can be found in romance. Even more especially with some subgenres like paranormal romance or monster smut. I wouldn't say traditional publishing frowns on that or kind of never would publish quote unquote monster smut, but the majority of what is out there is indie published. And that's typically because it tends to be more explicit in nature and a little bit more taboo as well. Also, traditional publishing is not just restricting with what authors are writing, but also with authors' input on their book titles, book covers. If you as an author who are being traditionally published want to have a say in those things, you do have to negotiate that in your contract. Typically, you just sign over your rights. They do everything, marketing, creating the book cover. All of those decisions are basically taken out of the author's hands. Now, on the indie published side, it is a lot more freeing. You can basically write whatever you want to write, and the author has all the control. And that is all well and good, but what also falls into the author's hands is marketing. You have to put your book out there. If you don't market your book on every social media platform, your book might not sell. From a reader's standpoint, I had no idea how much work is involved when indie publishing a book. I didn't know that until I became an aspiring author and want to indie publish my own work.
So thank you, Nicole, for just appearing there and also mentioning the ways in which she is a writer too, has so much more creative license and does everything herself. There's a lot of freedom in doing everything yourself in that you can make every single choice you want to make. If you want to put in too many pop culture references, then you can. If you want to use a certain language for a body part, then you can. There's no one to tell you you can't. There's no editor to edit it out. There's no one to say it won't be published if you don't use those words. That is the freedom that indie writers get, and I think it does give them a bit more creativity, again, in writing style, because there's no expectation for what kind of writing style people are expecting to read when they pick up your book. It's whatever you want it to be, whatever you think works. And I think one of the things that I liked about Alexis Hall and admittedly Santino Hassel and also Megan Erickson is that they would take pages to write their steamy scenes. And what I'm seeing a lot in traditional published books is either fade to black, or if they are going to have a steamy scene, they have one steamy scene and that's it, or they have a steamy scene but things are like quite mechanical and are described in a few sentences and a paragraph and it's over. And that's how I felt in Do Not Fall in Love. Whereas with Alexis Hall, we'll take a whole chapter to talk about sex, or just have one sex scene. They'll have a whole chapter on it and they'll have paragraphs describing different things happening, and it's like a whole thing. It's a whole chapter. It's a whole monument and experience in itself. And that length of time, he can choose to have all of that time just talking about sex, whereas maybe if it was a traditionally published book, they might just ask him to tone it down a little and develop some characters a bit more here, rather than have such an extensive moment for that BDSM sex scene, okay? And I appreciate the creative license that indie authors get, but as Nicole mentioned, there's just so much you're not getting by having all of that creative license. You're not getting the marketing done for you. You're not getting ads made for you. You're not getting that whole marketing package deal, which then makes your book stand out from all the others in the market, which is what you do get in traditional publishing, as well as that security in terms of payment. So I can understand why you might compromise on some of your creative license so that you can have some of those other benefits. And I can understand why so many indie published authors who do well then are happy to become traditionally published authors, because you get to focus more on writing and creating rather than having to do all the work of all the other elements yourself as well. So let's talk about sex, baby. Let's do it. So in terms of the sex scenes, I've already mentioned this before about the fact that there's so much longer often in indie books, but we're going to get it into personal preference here. And before I get into my personal preference, I want to hear from Chelsea Zhao, and she also reads a lot of romance. She reads indie, she reads traditional, and so she's got some things to say about her experience reading romance.
Hello everyone, my name is Chelsea, and when Olivia-Savannah mentioned that she wanted to do this video, I was super excited. Especially since I'm pretty sure I was the one that gifted her the book that started the entire conversation here. I absolutely love romance. I love books that don't have very much steam and books that do have steam, and I split them up here so you can see that I have ones that are both traditionally published and indie published. I personally identify as demisexual, which I've mentioned on my channel many times, and so for me personally, my favorite type of romance book, my favorite type of steam level are the ones that are very low steam usually. So either it can fade to black, or it can be ones where like the sex scene is more focused on the emotions of the characters while in the scene versus a play-by-play, or ones that are more like slow burn. We have more of the relationship development, and the sex scenes that do show up usually past the halfway point, sometimes the 75% way point, that kind of thing. One major difference that I personally have seen with indie versus traditional types of romance books is actually related to the advertising of the books themselves. With traditional publishing, I feel like the focus of the ads are going to be on the plot, maybe the character tropes or the romance tropes that you will expect to see in the book, whereas there has been a bigger push with indie and self-published books to have a sex scene or a piece of a sex scene as part of the draw for an audience. Me being me, like I said, I identify as demisexual. I am not somebody who is going to be mostly interested in the sex scenes of a book. I want the character development, the romantic relationship development. So when I see, oh, here's this new book, the cover looks cool, and the ad for it, like the snippet that they give you as like a hint of what's going to happen in the book, is part of a play-by-play sex scene or very, very dirty talk or anything like that, it actually turns me off of a book. Now, like I said before, I don't necessarily mind if there is steam in a book, but I don't want that to be the selling point. Especially because I've seen lately on Twitter a conversation happening that I think has happened multiple times before on whether or not romance books that don't have sex scenes can actually be classified as romance books. There's been this conversation happening lately about romance readers and how they need sex by like 30% of the book, and if there's no explicit sex on page, it doesn't count. Well, obviously that is not true. There are tons of romance readers, for one reason or another, that don't want explicit sex on page. So I'm very glad that Olivia-Savannah decided to bring up the differences between traditionally and indie published and get others' opinions on it as well, just because I do feel like there is a big conversation happening currently about what should be standard in the romance genre. And for me personally, I think as long as the book focuses on romance, focuses on the relationship between the two main characters, and has that happily ever after at the end, you can have sex in it. You don't have to have sex in it. You can decide the type of book that you would like to read. I also really appreciate reviewers who specify like a spice level. Like for me personally, I will tell you if the book I'm reading fades to black, or if it has one of those more emotional type of sex scenes instead of an explicit sex scene on page, because that is something that I as a reader would like to know. But otherwise, like I said here, I do love romance of all shapes and sizes, sex scenes, no sex scenes, indie or traditional.
So thank you to Chelsea for weighing in and talking a bit about the advertising, because I touched on marketing and how it very much differs between trad and indie publishing, but she mentioned a very good point about the way in which it's marketed. And I think that has to do a lot with some of the stereotypes people believe when they think they're getting an indie book. They just think it's going to be sex, 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 and then a little bit of emotional thing, and then some more sex, 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 which sometimes, you know, it happens. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to read that. But also, traditionally published books, there's a whole lot more of like emotions and discussions and forming a relationship, and then we get to the sex. And now we're going to get to my personal preference. I never thought I'd see the day I would say this on camera, but for me in a romance book, my favorite thing is when people have to develop a relationship. I love seeing friends to lovers and that kind of development. So it's very interesting to me that my favorite romance books all tend to have our main characters meet very quickly and have sex very quickly. One of my favorite indie books opens with a massive sex scene. It's just right there in your face, bam, at the beginning. And a lot of the ones I love really start with them meeting each other and banging very quickly. But then they realize that they have amazing physical compatibility and it's great, they have a great time, but now they want to do it again. And if they want to do it again, they're going to have to figure out a way to make an emotional connection and an emotional bond with the person. So that's my favorite type of romance book, where they get all of the sex done and they have a great time, and then they're like, oh, I want to do that again, but I need to get to know this person and I need to learn how to navigate a relationship and find what we have in common. And then it becomes very emotional. And even while they're trying to find that and navigate that, they're usually banging along the way, okay? They're usually continuing to have sex. But where the book ends is where their relationship starts, which is where they figured out the ways in which they can fit together as a couple. They figured out the ways in which they can have an intimate relationship. And although they've been having sex for like months, now begins their relationship. And it's funny because often in traditionally published romance books that I'm reading end the same way, in which they meet and they're not emotionally compatible and they figure out how to become emotionally compatible, and then they have one time of having sex and it's great, and then you know what? They're ready to really embark on a relationship. So they end in the same place, but the ways in which they get to that journey in terms of physicality and emotional relationships is very, very different. And there's nothing wrong with either which way, and I'm not saying all trad books do it that way and all indie books do it that way, but it's just interesting to me that more often than not indie do it the way that I like, and more often than not trad do it the way that Chelsea likes. So it's just interesting in terms of choices, in terms of how sex is included in the story, how sex is presented in the story. And again, it comes back to language, and in this time, as Chelsea said, with advertising, because for me personally, one of the make or break things about whether or not I'm going to like a book is how they do that first initial sex scene. What is very core, because I'm getting that language before anything else, is the language that they use when they're discussing that kind of thing. So in advertisements, I do kind of want to know how they're describing body parts, how they're describing actions, because if it's the ones that are not of my personal choice, I will be less likely to pick that up, and I'll move on to other books that describe things in ways that I more likely appreciate reading. Whereas if I'm picking up a traditionally published romance book, I don't really need an advertisement to talk about the language, because I'm already going in with the expectation that, yeah, there's not going to be a very extensive sex scene, there's not going to be loads of sex in it. It's more so going to be about the emotional journey, and I know what all of the writing styles are typically like for traditional published romance, so I do want to hear about the characters, because the characters and what they are like is what is going to make this book more unique to me than all the other traditionally published romance books, whereas the way in which the sex scenes are described and worded and penned are possibly what's going to make things stand out in the indie books for me. So because of the two different ways in which those books are published, it makes sense to me that those advertisements are done differently. But I would also be curious to see what would happen if we swapped those two advertising styles and see what happens and see what it brings to the forefront and what it brings to the light. And then last but not least, I want to talk about titles and covers, because these are big marketing things that are really different across the industry. So I am the kind of girl who picks up a book based on title. If I see a title that I really like, I'll just pick it up and read it. I read this book because I like the title. And some other books that are on my romance TBR are I Married a Lizard Man, His Banana, and Nuts, because I saw those titles and I saw those covers and they made me laugh, they made me smile, and that gave me the indication I'm gonna have such a good time with that book. Because already the author knows it's all jokes. The author knows not to take things too seriously. The author got me there. I even read a traditionally published book called Do Not Fall in Love by Jackie Lau because I love donuts and it's in the title, but also that's kind of a funny pun. And I enjoyed that. And actually that's one of the only times I've seen a romance title in traditionally published books and thought I really want to read that. Because often the traditionally published titles sound pretty similar to me, or sound very generic, or sound very tame, or sound just not that exciting. Would I rather read a book called I Married a Lizard Man, or would I rather read a book called Boyfriend Material? I'm gonna go with I Married a Lizard Man every time. Do I want to read a book called His Banana, or read a book called The Heart Principle? I'm gonna go for His Banana. So personally, the titles of the indie published ones are more creative, more fun, a bit more ridiculous, and I have yet to see those kind of titles reach the traditionally published romance books. Yes, Ice Planet Barbarians is traditionally published, but it was more so originally indie published. And so I just think the titles are not as exciting, they're not as fun, they're more safe. A Lady for a Duke, those kind of very play it safe kind of books. And so titles, I think indie books win. But in terms of covers, of course, because you don't have as much money as an indie publisher, you're going to go for those photo ones that you can pay certain amounts for and you can get them. And then you can make a cover pretty easy, pretty quickly from those like paid for images. And if it's romance and you're looking at like Mills and Boon's old-fashioned inspired covers, you're getting the ones that are very, oh my battery's flashing. You're getting the ones that are very much so, here's a naked man, he's sexy, there's going to be sex in this, therefore you need to see it. And then also in the traditional ones, you get these lovely illustrated, beautiful covers because they've got the budget to do so. But anyway, my battery's flashing, so I've got to end the discussion here. But the discussion doesn't end because you can tell me in the comment section, what do you think on anything I've said? Have I got the indie and traditionally published romance community completely wrong? Let me know if you've got any thoughts, if you disagree. Do you tend to read more indie published books? Do you tend to read more traditionally published romance books? Let me know in the comment section down below and give me romance reading recs. I always want them. So give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, subscribe button if you want to see more, don't forget, hit that notification bell to be updated every time I have a new video. You know what they say, onwards and upwards. Excelsior!